The widowed cowboy found twin Apache sisters freezing in the snow. Both wanted to become his wife. The wind screamed across the open plains as thick snow fell from the dark winter sky, covering the land in a cold white blanket. Jacob Carter rode slowly through the storm, his horse struggling against the icy wind. The lonely rancher pulled his heavy coat tighter around his body, but the cold still cut through him. Winter had always been harsh in this part of the country, but ever since his wife passed away 2 years ago, every season felt colder than the last. Jacob had spent the entire day checking his cattle before the storm got worse. Now all he wanted was to reach his quiet ranch house, light the fireplace, and escape the bitter wind outside. The ranch was silent most nights. No laughter, no voices, only the crackling of firewood and the distant howl of coyotes in the hills. As he rode along the frozen edge of the river, something unusual caught his eye through the falling snow. At first he thought it was just a pile of drifted snow, but as he looked closer, he noticed movement. Jacob quickly pulled the reins and stopped his horse. Two shapes lay on the ground near the riverbank, half covered by snow. His heart jumped as he climbed down from the saddle and rushed toward them. They were two young women. Their dark hair was dusted with ice, and their thin clothes were completely soaked from the snow. Their skin had turned pale from the freezing cold. For a moment Jacob feared he had arrived too late. Then one of the women weakly moved her hand. "They're alive," Jacob muttered under his breath. He knelt beside them and gently brushed snow away from their faces. To his surprise, they looked exactly the same. Their faces were identical, like reflections in a mirror. Twins. One of the girls slowly opened her eyes. They were dark and tired, filled with fear and exhaustion. "Please," she whispered weakly. "Don't leave us here." The other sister shivered violently, barely able to move. Jacob didn't waste another second. The storm was getting worse, and if they stayed out there much longer, they would freeze to death. "It's all right," he said firmly. "You're safe now." He lifted one of the sisters carefully onto his shoulder while helping the other stand beside him. She was so weak she could barely walk, leaning heavily against him as they struggled through the deep snow toward his horse. Getting them back to the ranch was slow and difficult, but Jacob pushed forward through the freezing wind until the warm light of his cabin finally appeared through the storm. Inside the house, he quickly started a fire in the fireplace and wrapped both women in thick wool blankets. He boiled water, prepared hot soup, and placed it carefully in their trembling hands. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the crackling fire and the quiet breathing of the two sisters slowly warming themselves. They looked around the small wooden cabin, their eyes filled with disbelief. "You saved us," one of them said softly. Jacob shook his head as he added more wood to the fire. "Anyone would have done the same." But the twins exchanged a quiet glance. Both of them seemed to know that wasn't true. Outside, the storm raged through the night, but inside Jacob Carter's lonely ranch house, something had quietly begun to change. Morning sunlight spilled through the frosted windows of the small ranch house as the storm finally began to fade. The thick snow outside reflected the bright light, making the entire valley glow white and silent. Jacob Carter stepped quietly across the wooden floor, adding another log to the fireplace so the warmth would continue filling the room. The two women he had rescued the night before were still sleeping near the fire, wrapped tightly in heavy blankets. Their breathing was calmer now, no longer the weak, desperate shivers they had when he first carried them inside. Jacob watched them for a moment, relieved that they had survived the freezing night. He poured himself a cup of coffee and stepped outside to check the barn. The storm had buried the fences in snow, and the horses snorted impatiently as he entered, grateful for the food he brought them. Jacob worked quietly, clearing a path and making sure the animals were safe. But his mind kept drifting back to the strangers sleeping in his house. When he returned to the cabin, the smell of something warm surprised him. The twins were awake. One of them stood near the stove, carefully stirring a pot while the other arranged bowls on the small wooden table. They had washed their faces and brushed the snow from their long dark hair. Even wearing Jacob's oversized spare clothes, they carried themselves with quiet strength. The sister by the stove noticed him first and smiled politely. "You should eat," she said softly. "You worked early." Jacob raised an eyebrow in surprise but stepped inside. "You didn't have to do that." The other sister gave a small shake of her head. You saved our lives. Cooking is the least we can do. They sat together at the table, the warm meal easing the last bit of cold from their bodies. For a few minutes they ate in silence, the fire crackling gently beside them. Finally, the girl who had spoken first placed her hand on her chest. "My name is Ayana," she said. The other twin nodded. "And I am Kaya." Jacob tipped his hat slightly. "Jacob Carter." The sisters exchanged a quiet smile before Ayana spoke again. "We are Apache sisters. Twins." Jacob had already guessed that much from their identical faces, but hearing their calm voices now made the previous night feel even more unbelievable. Just hours earlier they had been lying half-frozen in the snow. Kaya looked around the small cabin with curious eyes. "This place, it is peaceful." Jacob leaned back slightly in his chair. "Peaceful most days. Just me, the cattle, and too much quiet." The sisters seemed to understand that kind of loneliness. A shadow passed over Ayana's face. "Our village is gone," she said quietly. "Bandits came days ago. They burned homes and took everything. Our family," her voice faded before she finished. Kaya continued the sentence softly. "We ran. For many days. They had crossed mountains and forests trying to escape. Food had run out quickly, and the cold winter storm had nearly taken the last of their strength. By the time Jacob found them near the frozen river, they had already accepted that they might not survive the night. Jacob listened silently, his jaw tightening as he imagined what they had gone through. "You can stay here until the snow melts," he said after a moment. "This ranch has room." The twins looked at each other, relief flashing across their faces. But then Kaya said something that made Jacob pause. "In our tradition, a man who saves a woman's life becomes more than a stranger." Jacob frowned slightly. "What do you mean by that?" Ayana's gentle smile returned as she met his eyes. "It means our lives now belong with the man who saved them." Kaya nodded calmly beside her. "And we both wish to become your wife." Jacob stared at them in shock, nearly dropping the cup in his hand. Life on his lonely ranch had just become far more complicated than he ever imagined. The days that followed were quiet, but the air inside Jacob Carter's ranch house felt different than it had in years. Ever since the twins had spoken those surprising words at the breakfast table, Jacob had done his best to avoid the subject. Each morning he left early to work around the ranch, hoping that hard labor and long hours would clear his thoughts. But no matter how much work he found, the twins always seemed to be nearby. Ayana and Kaya had quickly adapted to life on the ranch. They rose early, often before Jacob, and helped with whatever needed to be done. Sometimes Jacob would walk into the barn and find Kaya already brushing one of the horses, speaking softly to calm it. Other times he would return to the house to see Ayana carefully repairing torn clothes or preparing food over the stove. They worked naturally, as if they had always belonged there. One afternoon Jacob was fixing a broken fence near the edge of the pasture when he heard footsteps in the snow behind him. Kaya approached, carrying a bundle of wooden posts. "You should rest," she said with a light smile. "You work like 3 men." Jacob wiped sweat from his forehead despite the cold air. "And you work like 2." Kaya laughed softly and handed him the posts. Across the field, Ayana was gathering firewood, moving calmly and patiently. The sisters rarely needed to speak to each other to understand what the other was thinking. Sometimes a simple glance between them seemed enough. Jacob had never seen anything like it. As the sun began to set behind the snowy hills, they all returned to the house together. The warmth of the fireplace quickly filled the room, and the smell of stew slowly spread through the cabin. For the first time in a long while, Jacob found himself enjoying the quiet evening. The house that once felt empty now carried soft voices, laughter, and the gentle sound of movement. Still, one question remained hanging in the air. Later that night, as they sat beside the fire, Kaya finally broke the silence. "You never answered us." Jacob looked up from the flames, already knowing what she meant. He sighed slowly. "Because I don't know how." The twins listened quietly. "You both deserve better than a lonely rancher who spends most of his life chasing cattle and fixing fences," Jacob continued. And besides, how could I possibly choose between you? For a moment the sisters said nothing. Then Kaya glanced at Ayana and a small smile appeared on her face. You think we asked you to choose? Jacob frowned in confusion. Ayana shook her head gently, her calm voice steady. We are twins. Our lives have always been shared. Kaya leaned forward slightly, her eyes warm but confident. We survived the same battles. We lost the same family. We walked the same path through the snow. Ayana nodded. And we made our decision together. Jacob stared at them, slowly beginning to understand. You mean, both of you? Kaya laughed softly at his expression. Yes. Both of us. Jacob leaned back, stunned by their calm certainty. The twins weren't competing for his heart. They had already decided that their future would be shared, just as their past had always been. Winter slowly began to loosen its grip on the valley. The thick snow that once covered the land started to melt under the warmer sunlight, revealing patches of grass and muddy ground around the ranch. Small streams of water ran through the fields as the frozen earth came back to life. Life on Jacob Carter's ranch had quietly changed. Where silence once filled the small wooden house, there was now constant movement. The sound of footsteps, soft conversations, and occasional laughter drifted through the rooms. For years Jacob had lived alone, speaking only to his horses or the cattle scattered across the land. Now every morning began with voices in the kitchen and the smell of warm food cooking over the stove. Ayana and Kaya had become a natural part of the ranch. Ayana moved through the house with calm patience, organizing supplies, repairing clothes, and keeping everything in order. She had a thoughtful nature, always thinking ahead about what the ranch might need next. Kaya, on the other hand, loved the open fields. She spent much of her time outside with Jacob, learning how to guide the horses and help with the cattle. Her fearless energy often surprised him. More than once he had turned around to see her riding one of the horses across the pasture with a wide smile on her face. Jacob couldn't remember the last time his home had felt so alive. One afternoon he stood near the barn, watching the twins work together in the small garden they had started beside the house. The soil was still cold from winter, but that didn't stop them from planting the first seeds of spring. They laughed about something quietly, their voices carried by the soft breeze. For a moment Jacob simply watched them. After his wife died, he believed his life had settled into a long stretch of quiet loneliness. He had accepted that the ranch, the cattle, and the endless work would be the only companions he would ever have again. But somehow these two sisters had walked into his life through a snowstorm and changed everything. That evening the sky burned orange as the sun began to sink behind the distant hills. Jacob called the twins outside and the three of them sat together on the wooden steps of the cabin. For a while they watched the sunset in peaceful silence. Finally Jacob spoke. When I found you near the river, I thought I was just saving two strangers from freezing. The sisters listened closely. But since the day you arrived, this place hasn't felt empty anymore. Kaya smiled softly while Ayana's calm eyes rested on him. Jacob took a slow breath before continuing. I've spent weeks thinking about what you asked me. He looked at both of them carefully. And the truth is, I don't want either of you to leave. A warm happiness spread across Kaya's face. Ayana lowered her head slightly, her quiet smile showing the same feeling. If you truly wish to stay, Jacob said, his voice steady, then this ranch will always be your home. And I will spend the rest of my life protecting both of you. For a moment the twins simply looked at him. Then they stood and embraced him at the same time, their laughter breaking the quiet evening air. The lonely cowboy who once believed his story had ended had been given an unexpected second chance. Sometimes life changes slowly. And sometimes, it arrives in the middle of a snowstorm, bringing a new beginning no one ever expected.